So with me this afternoon, Lance's time, we have Lance Weiler. Thanks for joining us, Lance. It's been a while since we chatted, so I'm so glad you agreed.
Yeah, no, excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
And you're joining us from New York?
That's correct. Yeah.
Very cool. So for those of you who don't know Lance, I'm going to do a really bad version, Lance, a potted kind of history. And then the first question will be kind of you making people aware of a little bit of your work. So I would describe you, and you can correct me later, as an immersive storyteller. Amongst many other things, you're a professor at Columbia University in New York as well. And I've invited you to speak because your work has always fascinated me. I think we first met probably, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago. And back then I would have been at Penguin, and I remember drafting you in, twisting your arm from an event we were at across the river to come and then talk to a group of my colleagues at Penguin at the time. And what I think I wanted to achieve from that is probably something similar to today, actually, is I just wanted to challenge convention within the frames of a traditional publishing house. All publishers quite rightly describe themselves as storytellers, but they do it in a very particular way. Every now and then they'll meander into some experimentation and different kind of format types, but nothing in the way that I know you do, from the little I know of your work. And I think the first thing I stumbled upon was something called Best 71. So that was probably 2012, 13, something like that.
Yeah. 2012.
Yeah. And I just remember seeing it and experiencing it. And then when it was framed as storytelling, that was the moment where I was like, "Yeah, of course it is." But I was working in this world where stories were something very, very particular. So that's how I would introduce you and describe you. How would you describe what you do?
Well, I think some of what I do is kind of difficult to classify. And I kind of like that. I kind of like living in that space in the sense that a lot of the work that I do mixes storytelling and emergent technology. When you were mentioning Bear 71 there a few moments ago, that was a project that I worked on with the NFB. And the NFB has a really interesting mandate, which I always loved, the interactive side of it, which is just to experiment. And so I think a lot of my practice is very much about that, right? It's kind of exploring what's possible, but it's always driven by storytelling. It's about storytelling and human experience first. And then that usually leads into, actually the technology. But the way I would describe myself is I'm a storyteller and I'm an artist and I'm an educator, so it kind of floats in and around those areas. But I'm fascinated by the moment that we live in and the potential that we have to tell stories in ways that maybe we haven't seen before. And I'm always wondering, like, what's going to be the great, novel of the 21st century, right? What's going to be a new form like that? And so I'm
Yeah.
constantly interested in the ways that we can interrogate this technology. It's not to say that, I think after doing this for over 30 years, and working with emergent technology, if it's not in service of story, it doesn't really matter. There's no point to it, in my opinion. It just, it can have utility and it can have different things that bring people together, but there's something really powerful with this idea of, being able to tell a story that is limitless or can spill off of screens and into the real world and back again, that can connect people in really meaningful ways. So that's kind of what I've been fascinated by in terms of my career.
And you've carried that into teaching, educating, working with students as well with DSL, the Digital Storytelling Lab. You want to tell us a little bit more about that? Or like what are its aims, its outputs, the type of people that you collaborate with, what you feel the students are looking for, where they come from?
Sure. Well, the Digital Storytelling Lab is something I landed at Columbia about 15 years ago and started teaching there. I'm a professor of professional practice, jointly appointed in film and theater, and I'm based within the School of the Arts. And the lab is very much inspired by, I would say, EAT, which is an acronym for Experiments in Art and Technology, that was set up by Bell Labs. A gentleman named Billy Kluver and Robert Rauschenberg ended up collaborating together along with a number of other artists and engineers to kind of experiment with this notion of transdisciplinary work. And I think the lab kind of builds on that tradition. We explore new forms and functions of storytelling, forms being emergent technologies, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, XR, the Internet of Things, but then functions are storytelling for learning and healing, mobilization, policy change, entertainment, and the arts. And so we do that by in three ways. We have programs, like a master's that we touch into. We have live events. We have an awards program that I do with Frank Rose every year, which is called the Breakthroughs in Storytelling Awards. We have prototyping festivals, and we build a lot of participatory kind of works that go off into the world. Our works have gone from the classroom out into the world and premiered at Sundance. We did a really cool collaboration with IDFA, Rock Lab, and the National Theater and their immersive storytelling studio. We've worked with folks at the World Economic Forum and the UN. We've worked with major studios, publishers, gaming companies. I think I've found that often the lab is this really unique place where you can experiment without some of the trappings that exist in other industries. And
Yeah.
so a lot of people come to us and are very interested in the experimentation that we're doing. For instance, we've been working with artificial intelligence since 2017.
Wow.
We're always kind of embracing and interrogating the technology and trying to figure out, like, okay, what does this mean? Like, how can we shape the tools before they shape us? Is kind of one of the things that we try to do within the lab.
That's a great point. And then, that point where you just raised there, you've been working with artificial intelligence since 2017. And in my industry, and where most of the people that watch us operate, AI is this sudden scary juggernaut. And I think everyone's intelligent enough to know it's not sudden. It has been around for a while, and they're using it in their everyday lives, but doing their shopping or whatever it might be. But it is, as you'll know, like a massive. I mean, the AI term is very generalist anyway, but it's a massive wrestling point at the moment. Be whether that's around issues of copyright or creativity or process and function, let alone artistically. So it's a big wrestling point at the moment. And I just remembered, Lance, shockingly, that in the middle of this, because you were talking about kind of I think you used function, where you're talking about the different societal ways in which things can be used. How I had done this global hackathon thing with Stephen Fry.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
you were, yeah, and I don't know why, I really should have remembered. But as you were speaking then, what dawned on me was everyone else, for anyone who doesn't know, we did all these hackathons all around the world in all kinds of labs and incubation hubs and these kind of things. But most people made artistic things or very kind of processy, functional things. But I remember, and the essence was people took the text from the book and the audio was available, imagery was available, some metadata, etc. That lingered on three particular themes: mental health, drug addiction, and sexuality. But I remember you did something so different. You used the essence of the story that was being told as a jumping off point for essentially what was a hack on mental health, right? As I remember correctly, which was so different, so different of an approach to everything else that was made. It was amazing. I need to dig that back out and have a look through the work. So thanks for the summary. So if people are going to look up your work, this is the kind of question you probably hate, but what would be your four go-to things if people are going to go? So what's this guy Lance made before? What would be your four go-tos?
I think I would encourage you, to look at the Digital Storytelling Lab, which you can find at digitalstorytellinglab.com, because that is like pretty amazing in terms of the growth of what that is. Because when I went to the school, there was just one course. I built it out into a whole program and all these really wild prototypes, and it has all these wonderful resources, and so that's something definitely to check out.
Mhm.
Project that I worked on, I would say, called Where There's Smoke, which is probably which I'm working and kind of building into this living, breathing kind of art book, which is really kind of about one of the most personal works I've ever made. I grew up in a firefighting household. My dad was a volunteer firefighter, amateur fire scene photographer. And we had two devastating fires in our lives. And when my dad was dying from stage 4 colon cancer, out of the blue, he invited me to come and interview him and ask him anything that I wanted. And all these skeletons came tumbling out of the closet. And so, I was kind of wondering, did he actually set these fires? Was he responsible in some way? And it just blew my mind in terms of what came out. And so it becomes kind of a meditation about life, loss, and memory, and it's had so many different really interesting forms. Most recently it was an installation on the High Line in New York where you could
Oh, cool.
interact with it via your phone. and it was like a 4-channel video installation, but it's existed as exhibitions, it's existed as online experiences, it's kind of taken different forms over time. Work would be Frankenstein AI, which you can find through the lab part,
Okay.
where we basically created an adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where Frankenstein's monster becomes a metaphor for artificial intelligence. And kind of crafted this immersive theater piece, and then later these series of AI hosted dinner parties around the world,
Wow.
right? And
Hmm.
then I guess the most recent one, which will come out as a full on installation in Miami later this year, it'll be 10,000 square foot. You'll step into the dead internet. You'll step into an AI slop kind of
Oh,
environment where you'll go looking for your doppelganger, and it kind of builds from like literary tradition of doppelgangers over time into this idea of what is truth and identity in a world of synthetic media. So those are kind of 4 touch points, very diverse in terms of what they're doing, but using emergent technology as these discursive artifacts to interrogate the underlying technology.
wow. You don't do things by halves. With that last example, the installation in Miami, in terms of how it manifests itself, is that something that you can only experience in person, or are there other iterations to other ways to experience that same?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question because I think a lot of the work and a lot of my work kind of bridges physical and digital all
Yeah.
the time. And so that particular installation will have elements where people from around the world can actually come into to touch points within it that will shape experiences that are unfolding in the actual installation. What's interesting too about the work, and this might be something, that we'll talk a little bit more about as we go, but a lot of my work is very participatory. It challenges the notion of authorship and ownership of stories. So the installation in Miami, what's really kind of radical about it, a lot of my work tends to be kind of radical, is that we're inspired, or I'm inspired by the Fluxus art movement, which was a generative kind of art movement, instructional art movement of the 1960s. That movement said, art should be taken to the streets. Anybody can be an artist, right? And a lot of interesting people touched into it. John Cage, George McCunis, Yoko Ono was affiliated, but was not an official member. But really interesting kind of works that were always instructional scores. You know, you get a set of instructions and then people would perform the art. It has a lot in common, ironically, with generative systems. I see connections to that art movement being relevant to the way that we think about generative artificial intelligence. But the thing that's really kind of wild about that piece or that movement, it was very much about democratizing the making of the art. The piece in Miami is really kind of like, how can we take that to the next step? So it's actually co-created with community, and then the community makes the installation that lives inside.
Oh,
We're at a place called Mad Arts, a 50,000 square foot space. But I think that that's relevant because it challenges that notion of one to many, and it's a many to many paradigm. And with these synthetic tools or these, synthetic media, where is the human touch is going to become more and more and more of an important thing in order to try to find authenticity
yeah.
within things that are becoming more difficult to know what is actually real. We're in this post-real world, post.
On that point, Lance, where does it do you sit on the point of does that even matter? What does it matter? What is real? What is not real? Even if we can't land on the definition, like what's the point of the conversation?
Well, I definitely think it matters in terms of geopolitical,
Yeah.
scenario.
Okay.
I think it does matter in terms of health. I think it does matter in terms of mental health.
Hmm.
But I think ultimately in the arts, it's a radical departure, like this ability to kind of move into a realm of where you can literally build worlds. There are these interesting kind of prototypes, and you're going to see more and more of this, similar to how, over the last couple of years, you've been able to use natural language to create video, audio, music. You can create songs with it. You can describe the song you want, whatever the style is, and so forth and so on. You're going to see a rise, and you're starting to see now a rise in I'd say over the last year and a half or almost 2 years, you can start to vibe code things, which means that you can actually use natural language to create tools, which is a pretty radical concept.
Crazy.
But ultimately some of the stuff that's coming that I've seen and that you can see now, like if you go and you look at a demo for Genie 3, which is from DeepMind, you can see some of these early world building kind of related tools where I can prompt a world with text and then the world unfolds and it's playable immediately. And it'll hold the physics of like if I paint in a room, it'll
Yeah.
hold that, and if I come back into it, I see it. The paint's still there, or somebody else can paint on top of it. So that's pretty radical in terms of it's going to be used to train robotics for embodied AI. It's really quite wild. But it also raises really interesting ethical considerations as it becomes more blurred between what is real and what is not real, and the synthetic worlds that we can create and the synthetic worlds that we retreat into.
Mm.
It raises a lot of interesting issues in terms of development for younger children all the way up in terms of how they're interacting with what is real to the way in which we interface with each other in society and culture. So I think reality is very important. And I think that I think in terms of using the tools in an artistic way, it's
Mm.
super exciting because ultimately these technologies are usually kind of the first groups to use them are the military and artists. They're the
Mm.
first to go to these emergent technologies and really challenge what they're used for and how they're used. And I think ultimately, to close the loop on your reality question, groups of people are going to be what helps to police this, to regulate this, because our representatives really don't have a clue. And the consolidation of power in and around those who want to dominate in the space is very strong. So, like, I think the more that we can tap into what's real and the
Hmm.
more that we can tap into what we want to be real, the
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. What we want to be real. And there's something in the back. I'm formulating a question around because you work so much more in the artistic space versus the space that I tend to operate in.
Sure.
And currently, whilst I'll talk a lot about consumers instead of characters of other kinds, right? There's always been a need to want to have the tangible and to own. Or in publishing world, you could sell 10 million copies digitally, but there's still some kudos in having that printed item on a shelf. So I'm wrestling with a question somewhere in the back of my head with all of these wonderful things you make that may be in the physical space and they may involve physical interaction. But largely speaking, I know you have done other things, but largely speaking, there's no physical output and things that there's no finite end to things, right? Which is the beauty in so much of what you're doing. And no, there's not one version of any of these stories. But I'm wrestling with what I'm going to ask on that one. It's bubbling away. So this stuff is going to blow people's minds that are listening, right? Because this is not the area that a lot of the people that I work with and speak to operate in. Where do your ideas start, Lance?
Well, I think one side of it is at the end of the day, like I love books. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
super into books. I collect them, I read them. I have old editions of books. I love
Mm.
literature. I love tangible things, right? Like I love celluloid. I love films.
Mm.
Like I love all these tactile elements
The
of the
documents.
world and documents, and I love documenting process and that's a
Mm.
big part of the art that I do. The ideas for me are generative in the sense that I think it's interesting to allow something to evolve. I guess I see it as a 21st century rewrite, right? Like I came up as a screenwriter and screenwriting's all, and writing in general is all about rewriting, right?
Mm.
Like, and so the way that I approach a lot of the work and where the ideas come from is they come from something that I want to try to figure out what I want to say. There's a why, there's a deep kind of set why to it, something that I want to get out into the world, which is no different from anybody who writes a novel, right?
Yeah.
Like
Okay.
something they want to say. And then it becomes like, how can I embody that? Or how can I put that into the world in a way that's going to be emotionally resonant? Right. And what form might that take? That's where, sometimes
And
it
does it
will.
involve other people and to what extent and what technology?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And who are my collaborators in this?
Mm.
And where does it stop being just something that I'm doing and the collaboration starts with other team members? Or, the collaboration involves different types of emergent technology in some interesting way. So I think where some of the things that maybe I'm saying could be seen as like signals to the future, like I'm kind of alluding to these things that are like systems that are happening, but the distance to get to them is getting smaller and smaller. I've been talking about some of these things for over 30 years. Now, the time to reach them and the acceleration of the development of the technology is crazy, right? Like it's just on an accelerated cycle. But like if I think about it and I kind of bring it into the publishing side, I think that, people will always, and I think it's going to become even more important that they feel that there's a human touch to the work, because with the rise with AI slop and not knowing what's real, people are going to want to gravitate towards some connection to a human being that is authoring something in some way, right? And the best stories, as we know, they're personal, but because they're personal, they're universal, right?
Mm.
And then it's just a matter of kind of thinking. I always think about publishing and love it. I think about like, what is the expansion of the book? What is a way that a book can live and breathe beyond one particular tangible asset as
Mm.
being a published work? And how might it be able to make it take of what we see in terms of audience or readership or access points or the challenges of discovery in terms of an oversaturated, algorithmically controlled
Yeah.
world, right? Like, what are the things that allow us to kind of express, in literary terms or bring those into these emergent technologies? Like a lot of my favorite students who come through the digital storytelling lab electives study dramaturgy. Like I love that element. They understand worlds, they understand literature, they understand the importance of character and the importance of plot and the importance of how a story moves itself, throughout whatever the form is that it takes. So I think sometimes I would encourage anybody who listens. There's this practice called speculative design, which
Uh-huh.
is really kind of about designing futures. And it has this one part of it where it talks about signals, and signals are all around us. It's just a matter of tuning into them, right? I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, I saw a headline that said food ATMs in Vietnam, something to that effect. And it was
Hmm.
like, whoa, what does
What's
that
that?
mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why do they have ATMs for food? Does it mean that people can't interact with each other because of the pandemic? Does it mean that food's become so scarce it's become a currency in some way? Does it mean like the access points need to be locked down and
Yeah.
controlled and can't be in a normal grocery store? It starts to stimulate all this thought and activate the imagination. So I would say like one thing that I'm always trying to do is tune myself into them because they're all around us, right? And it's a very simple kind of activity of like, just questioning, what does this mean? Why is this happening? And what could it mean to whatever industry I happen to be in?
I love this.
And sometimes the best innovation comes from these totally opposite places,
Yeah.
combining this with this other thing, and so I think that sometimes when people hear maybe some of the practice, it sounds foreign, but in the actual execution of it,
Yeah.
it's looking and saying like, oh, these things aren't that far off and they're
Yeah.
going to happen. So
Yeah.
how can they actually be aware of them
Yeah.
to advantage and leverage these
Yeah.
opportunities
Learn and
before I'm
embrace.
before I'm totally behind, and I can't, right? Like, so, I think it's just worth noting that, because
Yeah, no, I love this answer. And this, so I know you and I are both fortunate enough to travel a lot. This point you're making then with the speculative design thing and the Vietnamese example. Do you find a difference in that tuning in and finding those signals, right? If you're in a period of not travel and you're kind of doing your day-to-day practice, right? You're going to lecture, you're going home, whatever your daily routines are, versus an opportunity when you're traveling. Do you find you're able to tune in to those signals in different ways, or you're absorbing more in different places?
yeah, well, I think that travel is always a wonderful way to do it, right? Because it's a totally different environment. You're stimulated in very different ways. But I think you can adopt some of those methods and apply them in a daily
Mm.
existence, no matter where you are. And you can utilize like AI driven tools at times to help you do some of that as well, right? Because one thing AI is very good is at pattern recognition, So I think it's interesting to think about ways that you can train or utilize these tools in ways that align with your interests and your creative practice, not just from a productivity standpoint in terms of like, oh, I'm going to automate this process, but more so from like, how can this be some interesting kind of sounding board or challenging me to think in a different way about the things that I encounter? You know, like if I just carried and gave access to my photo roll and I just every day had some crazy thing where I was like, oh, I just take a picture of that. I take a picture of that. I take a picture of that. And then later I look at it and analyze it potentially with machine assistance. Are there patterns that emerge from it?
Right.
I'm a big fan of like, I did an everyday art project for 3 years, like where I made just a piece of art every day. And what was
In what kind of formats? Just whatever came to
whatever
mind.
the format. A lot of times because I work with code, they were
Mm,
code-based pieces of art, right?
okay.
So sometimes they were systems, you know, that you could interact with and they were generative and they would change. Sometimes it was like photography that I had done and then I manipulated through code, but it was really about just trying to be more present,
Okay.
right? And just trying to say like, I'm not going to care about the perfection around it.
Yeah.
I'm going to make the art and I'm going to just release it. And it was it was so hard. Like I tried the first time and I failed after a couple days. I don't know why I didn't just start again, but I waited the whole year and came around and did
Wow.
it on January 1st. I guess it was symbolic. And then I got like 3 months in and failed. And that was during the pandemic when you thought like,
Yeah.
oh man, you have time to do
Time
that.
on
But
your
I didn't
hands.
have the brain, you know, the bandwidth
Yeah.
to. And then the last time I started it and I just went for, you know, over 1,000. I think it's like 1095 or whatever the count is, and every day I made something. And out of that practice of just making all these things, all these opportunities opened up. And the reason I'm kind of bringing it up is sometimes it's just a daily practice of like,
Yeah.
I am going to look now for a signal. I am
Mm,
going to be aware of these crazy things that are maybe totally outside my field and
mm,
I'm just going to track them. And then I'm going to say, oh, that's interesting. What if, because what if
mm,
is an amazing way to tell stories, right? What if I combine these two things,
mm.
right? So, you know, as well as I do, Nathan, we've been kicking around at this for a while. Publishing, entertainment industry is not known for innovation, right? You know, just
But not from the
classically, it's
inside,
not.
right? It's
No.
always the
Yeah.
outside,
Always. Yes.
and then every now and then someone will go, "Ah." Yeah.
But, you know, opening yourself up to certain kind of daily practice or just thinking about like how you can see through different lenses or just like we live in an age where you can find anything.
Mm,
It's just a matter of how you're choosing to source it and
yeah.
the curatorial lens that you're looking through,
Yeah.
and how you challenge yourself with whatever it is that you're finding.
I guess the tricky thing there is, right, when you got the creator, so that might be an author, that might be a filmmaker, might be a musician, right? And if they're an artist making things because they want to make it for their art, that's one thing, right? And I imagine that ability to find those signals, challenge the what if, embrace, compile lots of different things, collaborate. That's amazing on the artistic side. But then there's always that kind of overhanging specter of in the commercial world where someone will start talking about the dry stuff, where they'll be
Oh,
like, the P&L on this, how many are we going to sell? And I think that's always been the part that I've struggled with. I was lucky to get a few projects through where I was like, yeah, the P&L would fail miserably, but we're going to be recognized. Or artistically, look at what this is achieving. Or it's keeping the musician or the author really happy because we're giving them a conduit and an ability to do something. That's been the bit that's always kind of been tricky on my side of the fence. Because I look like when I first started meeting people like you and coming to events I'd never gone to before, and you and I have been to a few together, I would just kind of sit with full imposter syndrome, you know, feeling like deep inside, knowing I had something to contribute somehow. But the imposter syndrome came from the fact that I was always coming from a commercial entity.
yeah.
It's always a tricky combination. I know we haven't got you much longer, Lance. One of the biggest growth areas in book publishing world is audio. And
Mhm.
everybody's talking about audio, you know, not just in terms of the money it makes, but in terms of reaching your audience, attracting people to stories in our world, our types of stories they wouldn't otherwise be attracted to. Guys, of course, are having a huge facilitatory impact on that, which some are embracing and other ones are shit scared of. Are you in your practice? Does audio specific stuff has it kind of reared its head in the same way, pushing forward as some kind of function that's like embedded itself into your world too, or has it always been there?
Yeah, well, I think that audio, well, the project that I mentioned, Where There's Smoke, used audio in a very interesting way, where you would travel. In one instance of it, you would travel with a flashlight, and you wear headphones and you move through a
Okay.
black box space. But the audio that you heard wasn't tied to a geographical region. It was based upon conditionals, if this, then that. Like, so if you went into the space and just hung around one area of the space, the score
Mm,
might just deteriorate and you might not hear any of the stories. Or if you walk through a threshold, you'd be hearing a story and you walk into the threshold of another room, and then all of a sudden the ambient score would start. But then when you turned around and walked back out through the threshold, it would pick up with wherever you left off with the story, right? Like, so it was very aware of where you were. So when I think about audio, I start to think about worlds, and I start to think about this idea of the potential of how these stories can evolve based upon where you are in the world or how you're interacting potentially with other people. So I see a social layer that's really kind of interesting, and the piece in Miami is primarily audio driven. Like, so the doppelganger thing, you go in and audio is bringing you into that world. So I'm very bullish on what you can do with audio and how audio can be generative in interesting ways, personalized in interesting ways, and can be, it's something. Historically, it's always been ahead. The
mm,
file sizes have been smaller.
yeah.
It just innovates in really interesting ways. So I'm very excited about what audio is, and a lot of my students end up using audio in their work too.
And there's something about the fact that stories, first and foremost, are spoken word. That's where they started.
Yeah.
Or maybe not. Maybe you got a different.
Yeah, they might have started with some drawings first,
Hmm.
but
Maybe.
for the most
Yeah.
part, yeah, I'd say vast
Yeah.
majority of them are oral
Yeah. Yeah.
traditions,
Yeah.
based on oral traditions.
So to just we've touched on it a little bit. With this point, we were there on about, or I was saying about these kind of rigid guardrails that the commercial side of things for commercial output tends to have. What scope do you see if you were being commissioned to be brought in with someone who goes, we've got this amazing story as a starting point with a very open minded author. Like, how do you tackle that commercial traditional publishing world that feels, largely speaking, threatened by technology,
Mhm.
with a real hesitancy to embrace it, and the two butt against each other so hard? What? How do you address this?
Well, I
I mean,
think
or do
that
we need to address it, or do the two have completely separate lives? There is room for the commercial output of movies, books, music, and then there's the artistic side.
Well, I would argue that some of the greatest literary works, have come from an artistic tradition or have been birthed in ways that they were pushing at the form or challenging or expressing themselves that maybe went against the norm at that particular time. And then later reflecting back, you can see they're great works. Whether they were commercially great at that time or not, that's a different
Yeah, yeah,
story,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But I think there's the potential of, what are you doing to enhance and build out the world of whatever that literary property is, right? And is there, like, kind of, and I'm going to talk in business terms, is there an ROI, on being able to do something, or even KPIs on being able to do something that would involve, thinking kind of differently in terms of the way that the book is discovered, in the way that the book is kind of shaped or expanded upon. Like, I think, like, something that tells all of it right now is I was talking to a friend who's an author, and he said, "Oh, did you know that Amazon now has a limit that you can only upload 3 books a day to sell?" And I was like, "What? 3 books a day?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's all about AI slop. I get it."
yeah,
Like, so I think that there's a fundamental reality that, like, okay, doing business as it's been done funded, forever, is not going to work when there's so much more
yeah,
noise and so much more crap. And that old adage that the best kind of rises to the top. Well, if people can't find the top, it,
yeah.
it doesn't matter.
There
It's
is no top
right.
anymore.
Right.
Yeah,
So then it's kind of like how, different readers and different demographics are reading and finding out about things in different ways, right? And so I'm not saying that like I'm not trying to say, oh, all attention spans are shorter, or,
Mm,
I'm not getting into anything that we have already experienced through social media. I'm just mainly saying, or basically trying to make the point that it does make good business sense to realize what is happening in terms of what's coming, and
mm,
then aligning with our authors who are interested in having a voice in an oversaturated world, right? Like, so at the end of the day, I find a lot of people reach out to me who are very well established talent who made their names on traditional systems, but now they're like, okay, I can't necessarily get the film made that I wanted to. And these are really
yeah,
large A-list
mm,
people, right? At times. And they're like, that thing that you were doing over here or what the lab is doing, that's really interesting. And so I think the appetite for that has become a lot more realistic
yeah,
in terms of a focus area, as opposed to like, oh, I wish I could have, or maybe it's going to happen. It's more like, wow, I see the writing on the wall. I see the loss of jobs. I see the challenge to make the work. And I see shifts in the way that people are consuming and interacting with the work. So
sure.
how can I, as a writer, as somebody who has something to say, how can I put it out into the world? And the more that I can put it out into the world, and the more authentic it is, and all those things that make great works, I see that emerging tech is a really wonderful way to augment that creative process. I'm not saying that, like, the technology does not matter if it's not pushing the story forward. It's a waste of time. It doesn't make sense. So, like, embracing it, but then thinking about the way in which you're utilizing it, whether it's something that's helping you in terms of your own artistic practice or the creative process, whether it's something that's allowing for that process to be shown and shared in unique and interesting ways, whether it's allowing parts of what you're doing to be reimagined or remixed, whether it's, challenging and thinking about, sometimes what's old is new again. What was it, like Charles Dickens, when he wrote, a lot of his stuff was serialized, right? So, like, it's the kind of thinking about, well, what is the future of serialization? What is the future of personalization in and around work? What does that mean? Is there ways that people can add social layers to the books they love? You already see all these book clubs that exist. They're a big driver for the marketing and promotion of books. How are they modernized, right? How do they become distribution or further, like discovery engines for what the work is, right? So it's like a whole ecosystem approach, I think. It's not any one particular part of it. It's like
Yeah.
holistically kind of looking at it.
And I think super simplifying it, is this about whichever industry you're in, about having the right, almost putting your consumer hat on. And by consumer, I don't mean someone who necessarily buys a thing, but I mean visits something, takes part in something, whatever it might be. But you've got to understand what the consumer wants, right? What they want to experience. How else whether it might be around how they discover, or how things are made, or the technologies and all these kind of things. So is it as simple as making sure the people that are sat on the side within these commercial houses have got that awareness and those skill sets and are from different walks of life with different interests of their own? Because this, yeah, I better be careful with what I say. Is it that simple? Just having a breadth of people looking in who are actually using these things all the time. Because I do see that we sit there and we'll have all these debates, all the various bookie events, and they're people from book world mostly. Of course, there's the intelligent outsiders coming in, educating and inspiring to some degree, and those kind of things. But largely, it's the same people who make books or make records or make films doing the same thing they've always done. But unless they get that newer skill set and that type of consumer also working with them, or is that too simple?
No, no, I think the transdisciplinary nature of what you're talking about, or just the different perspectives of different
Mm,
lenses, is incredibly valuable across all
mm,
different industries, right? Like, I think you get kind of entrenched in a certain way of working. There's
yeah.
certain ways that it's always been done, and that gets ingrained into the culture, and it becomes harder to kind of move. It's like, it's like a huge tanker that can't really kind of move, even though it's seeing it, and it just becomes totally reactionary, and
Yeah.
then it's too late. But yes, I think some of it is like, it's like investing, like having somebody or parts of teams, and I know a lot of people do this in different industries.
Mm,
People That's what they do. They take the time to understand the cultures. They take
Yeah.
the time to understand how to, you know, be part of those cultures, listen to those cultures, but more importantly, how to translate what those cultures are doing into whatever the industry, the group that is going to work to try to figure out a way to reach
Yeah.
them or sell them something. So yeah, I think yes, sometimes simple is the best way, but there's certain hierarchical structures that prevent that from happening, and certain anxieties around being wrong or feeling like you don't know how it actually operates and trying to clamp down on what you know the world to be. Or
Yeah.
it becomes this thing of where the orbit, you start to make all your calls and judgments based upon this little bubble that you kind of exist in. And you're like, well, I got my son does this and his friends do that. But
Yeah.
then
But that's,
it's
yeah. Yeah.
like, okay,
Yeah.
that's the extent of how far you get. I mean, that's important. It's important to
Mm,
understand
mm.
generationally what's
But it's not,
happening,
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but, like, how do you go further than that? So, some of these things are like, we're talking about, like, trend forecasting or aligning and courting, like Henry Jenkins, kind of talks about this in some of his work, like courting communities to
Yeah.
better understand, not just building the community, but courting and finding alignment with different groups.
I think it's really encouraging to hear, though, this to the point you made a few minutes ago, this shift that that people are opening into, they may be butting against a certain thing, or the movie's not being commissioned in the traditional way, and then starting to explore. And I guess that's the way that not every story that's written needs everything made and embellished around it. Some of them are going to be perfect in the beautiful little book. Other ones, welcome a little bit extra. And it's the same in the move we're seeing in the audio space in particular, how there's always going to be the space for the straight, well-read, single voice narrator.
Mhm.
And then now there's a move to these massive productions as well. But not every book deserves one of them either, or would appropriately fit one. Lance, I'm going to let you go because I'm aware time is tight. I think you will have excited, inspired, and blown people's minds in equal measure in
Well,
this
that's very kind.
short burst. So I really, I really want to say thank you again for your time, and I love it. I probably won't sleep now. This always happens when you and I speak, because then my head will just be whirring this stuff over for hours and hours. But I love this point about finding the signals, because that's
Yeah.
something everyone could do, right? Everyone. We don't have to be able to code. We don't have to be filmmakers or games makers or anything like this. We don't have to be someone that's sought to understand how AI impacts our personal lives or our working lives. But some of us will be those things, but all of us can look for those signals. I really like that point as a takeaway that everyone can do this. That's great. But there's so much in here. And then I'm going to hold you, Lance, to it. We definitely need to make sure we catch up.
Yes, yes, that would be great. Would love that.
We won't
Yeah,
leave the
and
gap
you
this time.
you had a question on there that I thought was really interesting. You asked me about a
Mm,
literary property, in
yeah.
terms of copyright, and I think House of Leaves would be amazing
Okay.
to do something with. Are you familiar with that book?
No. Here's a buy.
You gotta check it out. It's like it amazes me that they were able to publish it, because it's a book that it's almost like the book itself is like an alternate reality game.
Okay.
What's using the page, how it's nested inside itself,
Mm.
how it's meta layered, how it's like it works in so many different levels simultaneously. An interesting kind of dense work.
And it still works on the page.
And it still works on the page. Yeah. It's really fascinating. It definitely requires attention,
Yeah.
but it reminds me of, and it's interesting because I love the book, but I had seen there was some stuff just recently that was blowing up on viral, mainly because somebody who does like documentary on April 1st had made it as though there was a documentary about the book. And what's interesting about the book is that the gentleman, he kind of lives in a house that's larger inside than it is outside, right?
Okay.
Like, and it's evolving and changing. It's very kind of liminal. It's a very precursor to like back rooms kind of
Okay.
thing.
Yeah.
It feels of the internet in certain regards, but it's an interesting work. So when you put that in there, I just wanted to mention that was something
Yeah. No, thanks.
that would be
I was
that would
being
be
kind and
really cool.
letting you go. there's a whole heap of stuff I could keep talking to you about. But
No, no, I just wanted to, just want,
yeah, no, I love it. But just lingering on that point, and I will let you go. At any point with your projects, forgive me for not knowing. Have you gone to a living author and said, "Look, you've written this thing. This in book form. I love it, and I've got these ideas where we could go with this."
I haven't, I did that with David Cronenberg as a filmmaker.
Yeah,
And then I did a piece around Poe, but that doesn't count. It's not a
and
living.
Shelley doesn't count, but
Shelley
you know
doesn't
they're
count.
both
They're
amazing.
also in the public domain, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But a lot of the early kind of prototypes that the lab did or has done have been literary based.
Mm,
So
mm,
super interested in it. Would love to do that. Would love to work with somebody and you know, because I think like a lot of what over the career and what I've kind of learned is to be a bridge.
yeah.
Like I understand storytelling. I understand like a number, but
Mm,
ultimately, finding it's all team, right? So finding people who would be interested in challenging what they've put on the page and to do something that allows it to live and breathe in really interesting ways that are true to what the work
mm,
is, right?
mm,
Like it's not, you know, it's not, it's something that extends the work. Or
yeah.
maybe I've often felt like authors, you know, my writing partner for years, he's like a New York Times best selling author. And, his mind and the way he thinks. I always love riffing with him when we would write things, right? Like it was just really dynamic and
Yeah.
exciting and you know, and so I think if somebody's enriched and interested in character and the way in their story can kind of live and they're interested in worlds, would love to, you know, interact or collaborate. I think it'd be really cool to establish some type of rhizome, and maybe this is a point of intersection that we could do at some point
Mm,
this through the lab. Rhizome, which does a lot with code, I helped them do some stuff with the journalism school a number of years ago, and it was 7 on 7, 7 creative technologists with 7 journalists,
yeah.
right? And come together and they do some really cool kind of expression. It'd be really wild to do some type of a gathering or some type of you know, it doesn't have to be like, I'm not saying it has to be a hackathon. I'm saying it's like something that is kind of in the spirit of what EAT was, right? Technology at that time, it was engineers and artists. Now I think because the gap is narrowing and anybody can start to make things, you know, like I've been, you know, I've been all over vibe coding for a long time, but I do know how to code too. But the thing is, like authors being introduced to that, you know, in the way that
Yeah.
they could actually, you know, because I think the thing about vibe coding that's really wild is, I think Marshall McLuhan said, you know, we make the tools and they shape us. But
Mm,
if you look at the tools that were made during the social media kind of, you know, period, we're still dealing with the fallout from that.
yeah.
And a lot of those groups are the ones that want to carry us into the AI side of things. And you're
Mm,
like, well, what could go wrong with that? Everything. So, but to imagine that you could create tools, and tools is an expansive definition, the way I'm
mhm,
thinking of it.
yeah.
It's tools that could aid your creative practice, but it's also tools that could challenge the way that the world is expanded off the page, right? And I'm not saying that it has to be. I'm
Let the
not talking
creators be the
clean.
catalyst.
Yeah, yeah. So because ultimately it's natural language that you use with vibe coding,
Yeah.
authors are well positioned
Mm,
be able to do phenomenal things with it. And a lot of the work that we do at the lab has purposely not really gone down the route of generative AI because of like how the models are trained,
yeah, yeah.
copyright issues, all of that. We've lived in the code side, and vibe coding in my mind is just like phenomenal.
So Lance, once again, man, really just fantastic to have you with us. Thanks so much for being generous with your time. And I really look forward to seeing the fallout in a positive way of everything you've kind of chatted people through here. And no doubt I'll get bombarded with a list of questions. And I look forward to us getting creative together too.
That sounds great. Thanks for having me, Nathan. Really appreciate it.
Take care. We'll catch up soon, Lance. Thanks a lot.